Good morning. It's great to be here. I'm grateful to be back here worshiping with Bethel Mennonite again. So let's start with a quick preview of what everyone can expect today. So first, I'm going to start with a confession. Second, we're going to look at something Jesus said. Third, we're going to do a study in Greek. Fourth, we're going to have a history. And then last, we're going to take all of that and we're going to tie it together. I promise this will be quick and painless, so no fear. I see no reason we can't get through all of that, get you home in a decent time. If you're an Eagles fan like me, probably for the second half. So I have a confession to make. When I was a child, there were foods that I did not like to eat. A couple examples of those would be liver, stewed tomatoes, and I recall some kind of Jell-O salad that had olives in it. I don't know what it was, but I can assure you it was pretty gross. Now, my parents had a couple different ways that they would manage any kind of picky eating. And I remember one particular incident where I had some food in front of me. I didn't want to eat it. And they told me, pretend like it tastes like macaroni and cheese. And if you can pretend that it tastes like macaroni and cheese, it will. Now, I get it. That sounds like kind of a ridiculous statement, right? So I'm not trying to make fun of my parents here because there is some truth to that. You know, our thoughts and what we believe can make changes in the physical world. There's times where we can think ourselves sick. We can think ourselves well. And after all, that's what prayer is, right? It's focused and intentional thought. However, for me, this turning liver into macaroni and cheese kind of thinking had some problems. Most importantly, I could never make it happen. It didn't matter how hard I tried. It didn't matter what nasty food was in front of me. It never happened. And so guess what I did? I gave up. I stopped trying. Now, how many of you have ever been in a similar place? How many of you have ever doubted that a situation would work out for the best? Have you ever felt like life is maybe one step forward and two steps back at times? Maybe the healing that you're looking for hasn't came yet. Maybe the prodigal son or daughter has yet to return. Maybe the grief, pain, depression, anxiety, maybe that continues to return. And regardless of what those things may be for all of us, can you relate to feeling like your prayers aren't being answered? Can anyone relate to feeling like maybe I'm not believing hard enough? Maybe I'm not trying hard enough. Maybe my faith isn't strong enough. And that's why nothing is happening and the answers aren't coming. Well, if that's the case, if you've ever felt that way, then this morning I have great news because Jesus gives us an answer to these situations. Now, this is a well-known teaching of Jesus that we're going to look at. And this morning we're going to look at it from a couple different perspectives. And my hope is that through this process is going to offer us some new insights into our own faith journey. And the goal is that we leave here inspired and encouraged. So again, I'll read this scripture again. And if you want to, you can turn to Matthew 17, verse 20. And in this chapter, in this story, the disciples have asked Jesus why they couldn't heal a demon-possessed boy. And Jesus gives them the answer, because you have so little faith. Truly, I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Now, I have another confession to make. There's times where I have a problem with what I just read. There's times where I don't always like that. And why is that? Well, I don't really know what size my faith is compared to a mustard seed. And how do you measure the size of your faith anyway? And if what I'm asking for isn't happening, does that mean my faith is too small? Does that mean I'm doing something wrong? So I don't know about you, but I feel like there's times in my life where I'm trying and I'm really trying and I'm believing. I think I'm believing. I think my faith is strong and I really want to believe, but nothing is happening. And so therefore, maybe I'm not trying hard enough or my faith isn't big enough. And so all I have to do is believe harder, right? And if I could just get my faith to the size of that mustard seed, then I know everything would work out the way I want it to. And so I'm really trying, and I'm trying to grow my faith. But again, I don't know what size my faith is compared to that mustard seed. So I'm trying to make it grow bigger, but honestly, I don't even know what muscle to flex to make that happen. So nothing is happening, nothing is changing, and I give up. Now, when what we read in the Bible doesn't necessarily line up with what we experience in real life, we have some options, some choices. One is to ignore it. We can pretend that it never happened. And I don't recommend that. Another is to throw out the entire Bible as useless and not relatable. Again, I can tell you from my own personal experience, I don't recommend that. Now, what I would recommend as helpful is to take a closer look at the text, specifically at any potential translation differences and also the context. And that may sound a little painful or maybe boring, but I promise you that it will be enlightening. And if you don't believe me, well, we're going to do that right now, so you can decide for yourself shortly. So let's look at the text and get the Greek out of the way first. And I'll give you a disclaimer, I am not a Greek scholar. Now, fortunately, there are many resources available for those of us that are not Greek scholars. So I'll read you the literal Greek translation, and I found this on BibleHub.com. So the literal Greek translation of Matthew chapter 17, verse 20 says, "And he said to them, because of the little faith of you, truly for I say to you, if you have faith as a seed of mustard, you will say to the mountain to this, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." So that actually sounds pretty close to what we read earlier, right? Maybe some of the words were a little funny and out of order. But did anybody notice the main difference in there? There's just a very subtle difference, and it's size. In the original Greek transcript, Jesus does not mention the size of the mustard seed. And I find this fascinating because the most common teaching we hear about this revolves around our faith in comparison to the size of the mustard seed. And we've heard this our entire lives, right? A tiny little bit of faith can do amazing things. It can move mountains. And you know what? That is absolutely true. The tiniest shred of faith can produce the most amazing miracles. So I'm not saying that that teaching is wrong, because after all, size is a characteristic of the mustard seed. However, it's not the only characteristic. So what I'm suggesting is that approaching faith from just a one-dimensional aspect of size can be limiting and not always helpful. And I think approaching faith from just the sole standpoint of size brings with it a certain amount of inherent anxiety, namely, am I doing enough? Or is it possible I'm doing something wrong? So we can see simply by looking at the original text, the original language, Jesus is making a metaphor here. If you have faith as a seed of mustard, meaning if your faith has metaphorical traits similar to the physical traits of a mustard seed, it can move mountains. So are you starting to see how that very simple and, admit it, painless exercise of digging just a little bit deeper has now taken us from just a single characteristic of size to this whole wide world of open possibilities? So let's go another layer deeper. And let's look at what's happening in the story, because the mustard metaphor that Jesus makes isn't an accident. He says it in a specific time, in a specific place, for a specific reason. So let's understand this verse in context of the larger story. To do this, we're going to rewind to Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 29. And I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of the next few chapters. So starting there in verse 29, Jesus is going along the Sea of Galilee. He's healing, he's teaching. He goes up a nearby mountain and he feeds the 4,000. And then we read that he gets in a boat. He sails to the region of Magadan. And that is a region on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's the beginning of chapter 16, where the Pharisees start to test Jesus. And so he leaves. The next place he pops up is the town, the city of Caesarea Philippi, which is north of the Sea of Galilee. And while there, Peter is honored. Jesus honors him for professing Jesus as the Messiah, and then he immediately gets chastised for saying that he would not be crucified and die. And then we reach the beginning of chapter 17. Jesus goes back up a mountain. The transfiguration occurs. And as Jesus, Peter, James, and John are coming back down the mountain, they have their encounter with the rest of the disciples, the demon-possessed boy and his father, at which point Jesus makes the mustard seed metaphor. So do you have a good idea of how this story flows now? And this gives us a framework to really understand what Jesus is saying a little clearer. And that's because now we know where Jesus was and what he was doing. And that was mainly sailing on the Sea of Galilee and climbing up and down mountains. So what we need to uncover now is, why is the mustard seed important? So we know Jesus doesn't misspeak, right? He is intentional with what he says. So why does Jesus single out the mustard seed? Again, it can't just be about the size, because there are many seeds that are smaller than a mustard seed. And in fact, many orchid seeds are no bigger than a particle of dust. And this includes the black orchid, which is a plant native to the area that Jesus's audience would have been familiar with. So if Jesus was trying to make a metaphor solely based on size, there are some options that would have had a greater impact and meaning as far as those opposites. So what other characteristics make the mustard seed important and relatable to his audience in that time and place? Well, to understand this, we need a history lesson. So in the year 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey conquered the region of Judea and the Galilee. And after the conquest, he was instructed by the Roman Senate to build ports and harbors on the Mediterranean, the Dead Sea, and the Sea of Galilee. However, they did not give him any money or funds to start those projects. So while the general Pompey was fighting with the Roman Senate trying to get his funds, his chief engineer, who was a man named Albinus Gaius, had nothing to do. Now, Albinus was a man of many talents and diverse interests, one of them being botany, of all things. And because he had no ports and harbors to build, he started experimenting with the plants in the region. And he quickly discovered that the mustard plant grew really well in the mountains around the Sea of Galilee, particularly in the mountains that had a high limestone content. So Albinus went around planting these mustard seeds all over the mountains. Don't know why, but he did. And that had a completely unintended result. So as the mustard plants grew down into the rocky soil of the mountains, they began sucking out all of the limestone content. And as the roots grew larger, it broke apart the rocks, and these big boulders started breaking off the mountain and rolling down, rumbling down to the base of the mountain. Now again, Albinus was an engineer, and obviously he was no dummy. So he took those boulders, relocated them to the Sea of Galilee, which at this point was quite close by, and he built the ports and the harbors requested by the Roman Senate. So in other words, we can see that the Romans accidentally discovered a very inexpensive quarrying process. More importantly, we can see that quite literally, a tiny mustard seed can break down a mountain, and the mountain was quite literally moved to the sea. And just as important, we can realize that this process was something Jesus and his disciples would have been very familiar with, and very likely would have been surrounded by at the time Jesus made this metaphor. See, isn't that amazing? Simply by looking in a few different places, by digging just a little bit deeper, this is where our understanding and our faith starts to increase. So let's put all this together. All right, so we know from the Greek that Jesus is talking about more than just the size of the mustard seed. And we know from the biblical text that Jesus was in the region of the Sea of Galilee and the surrounding mountains when he taught his disciples the lesson about the mustard seed. Now, from historical documents, we know that the mustard seed quarrying process is something that happened in that area and very likely would have been known by Jesus and his disciples. Again, from the biblical text, we know Jesus was on a boat in the Sea of Galilee multiple times, so it's very likely he passed through these ports and these harbors that were built by the mustard quarrying process. He had been going up and down mountains all through these passages, mountains that very likely were covered in these mustard plants. And this is the point to me where scripture just comes alive. I mean, picture Jesus in this setting, surrounded by these mountains. There's a port over here with these big rocks, and there's these mountains covered in mustard plants, and he's pointing, he's talking to his disciples, and he's pointing and saying, look, the mustard seed. Have faith like the mustard seed, turning to point to the Sea of Galilee. Move from here to there. Nothing will be impossible for you. See, with all of this background information at hand now, we can learn a lot about faith. And I'd like to highlight just a couple things for all of you this morning. Based on what we've learned about the mustard seed, this is a process that takes time. It takes time for the mustard seed to grow and to eventually break down the mountain. Now, second, the work that is happening, we can't see most of it a lot of the times. It is the roots that are doing the work below the surface, pulling the nourishment from the rock, growing larger, breaking the rock apart. Just because we don't see anything happening doesn't mean God isn't at work. Now, third and last, it takes more than one mustard seed to break down a mountain. It takes an entire community working together, each doing their part as best they can. We can't do this on our own. Now, I'm going to repeat this because I want to make sure everyone understands. I am not saying that instantaneous miracles won't happen. And I am not saying that a small step in faith won't produce miraculous results, because I believe it will and it can. I believe that miracles have happened. I believe miracles are happening, and I believe there are miracles that are yet to happen. What I'm saying this morning is, let's not limit our faith to just thinking that it's a result of how hard we believe. Or we can say it another way. Maybe instead of viewing faith as simply an intensity of belief, it might be more helpful at times to view faith as the consistency of our belief. And I think that's important, so I'm going to repeat it. Maybe instead of viewing faith as only the intensity of how hard we believe, maybe it would be helpful to view our faith as the consistency of our belief. And I want to say the story that Kurt told this morning in his call to worship, and he said about maybe I'm like a mustard seed, I would agree with that, because I heard consistency in that story, praying for weeks before traveling. That's consistency. That is faith like a mustard seed. So yes, Kurt, you are like a mustard seed. And I think we could also summarize it this way. So I think the message that Jesus is telling us here could really be summed up as, don't give up. I think Jesus is trying to encourage us here. See, we have all faced mountains in our life, right? And we're probably all going to have to face another mountain or two or more during the rest of our lives. And this is what is so awesome about your life, my life. Jesus gets it. And Jesus gets it because Jesus didn't always get what he asked for either, did he? See, Jesus faced some pretty big mountains during his life. And I would say the greatest of those, sometimes we call it Mount Calvary. And Jesus asked for that to get taken away. He prayed for that to get taken away. And guess what? It didn't. He had to face that and he had to go through it, but he persevered. And there were things happening God was doing behind the scenes through that process. And we ended up with an amazing result of the resurrection and eternal life for us all. So we've all been through some challenges, right? We'll probably all face some challenges. Maybe some of us are in the middle of some challenges right now. And whatever those things are, whatever those things may be in the future, I want to encourage you. And I think Jesus wants to encourage you. Don't give up. Remember, just like the mustard seed, sometimes it's a process that takes time. And remember, we may not always be able to see everything that's happening, but we can trust that God is with us, and we can trust that the miracle process is happening below the surface, just like the roots of the mustard plant. And look around you. Faith requires community. You may not be able to overcome this mountain on your own. So use the resources around you. Remember, I'm not saying that miracles won't happen. I believe Jesus is telling us here, don't quit before the miracle happens.